Good morning, everyone. I see some participants are still joining, so I'll give a minute for that process to carry on. Great. Well, I think we've got everyone who's joining. So good morning to everyone in DC. Good afternoon, as the case may be in other parts of the world. Thank you very much for being with us for this discussion of our policy paper, Bias in Nuclear Security Implementation, Solutions to Identify Threats and Strengthen Security Culture in the United States. Thanks for being flexible in our adjustment to a fully online format. We'd hoped to do a hybrid format with some in-person participation in our offices. However, as many of you know, DC has had a beautiful blanket of snow, but that creates the usual challenges with getting kids to school and getting into the office. And we thought discretion was a better part of valor, and that we'd get more people would be able to participate if we went to this online format. So thanks for bearing with us on that. And we're looking forward to a great discussion and questions from all of you. This paper is the culmination of a project that the Stimson Center undertook in October, starting in October 2022, to explore the intersections between insider threats, nuclear security culture, domestic violent extremism, and diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges in the US nuclear security field. This was a fascinating and very meaty topic set to examine, and we gratefully acknowledge the financial support for the work from the US National Nuclear Security Administration, in particular its Office of International Nuclear Security and its Nuclear Security Women Initiative within that office. I believe we have Nuclear Security Women's Taylor Hart-McGonigal joining us today as an audience member, so thanks very much, Taylor, and to the Nuclear Security Women Initiative. I want to quickly introduce Annie Trentham, research assistant with the Partnerships and Proliferation Prevention Program here at Stimson, one of our co-authors. She'll be monitoring our Q&A today. I am Christina McAllister. I sort of introduced myself up front. I'm the director of the Partnerships in Proliferation Prevention Program here at Stimson. And we have two additional guests with us to discuss the report and the issues that it raises. First, I'm going to introduce Jack Brosnan from the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Jack serves as a program officer with NTI's Nuclear Materials Security Program. And in this role, he leads efforts to advance gender equity in the nuclear policy community through an initiative many of you are likely familiar with, the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy, as well as assessment and tracking of nuclear security conditions through the NTI Nuclear Security Index, and generation of new solutions for the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle. Also with us is Viviana Espinoza Moreno, who joined, she's from the World Institute of Nuclear Security. She joined WINS in September 2021 as a gender policy officer, playing a crucial role in the implementation of the organization's gender program. Her primary role is to provide advice on best practices and innovative approaches to boost the representation of women and people with diverse gender identities in the nuclear security sector. Viviana has developed comprehensive strategies to design inclusive programs and projects while advising on workplace policies that support gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. Additionally, Viviana is the co-author of the WIN's Self-Assessment Tool and Action Plan on Gender Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, published in 2022. And also of the Advancing Gender Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Nuclear Security Sector Reporting Framework, published just last year in 2023. So welcome, Jack, and welcome, Viviana. Looking forward to a good discussion. So it looks like Viviana may be having some technical issues. So hopefully she will be able to join us shortly. But in the meantime, I'm going to move on and provide an overview of the research project. Let's see, trying to make my slides move here. There we go. So we had two main research questions, as you can see here on the slide. I'm going to spend the first part of the presentation unpacking a little bit where we see bias in threat construct and the issues that creates. And then we'll move on to creating a diversity, equity, and inclusion nuclear security culture, which we argue can strengthen nuclear security implementation, as well as address homogeneity, equity and inequity and exclusion in the nuclear security workforce. Before we dive into the report itself, I should say a word about our methodology. We conducted extensive desk research of existing literature on domestic violent extremist threats in general, and with respect to nuclear critical infrastructure, as well as on bias in nuclear security implementation, workforce demographics, and a number of other relevant topics. We also circulated an anonymous survey. We held 4 virtual roundtable discussions and conducted 10 interviews. And we're very grateful for the participation of the numerous government, industry, and civil society practitioners, leaders, and experts in the field who generously shared their time, experiences, and insights with us for this study. So now I'm going to spend a few minutes unpacking our argument about bias in the nuclear security sector. We argue that bias is rooted in the particularity of US history, including slavery and segregation, Native American exclusion policies, selective immigration rules, and unequal treatment of women before the law. Together with more recent events such as the 9/11 attacks by Islamic extremists, these elements have shaped today's homogeneous US security establishment and culture, and by extension, its nuclear security culture, as one focused predominantly on threats that are external or foreign. The January 6th, 2021 breach of the Capitol building can be seen as an inflection point in threat perceptions. An FBI and Department of Homeland Security report into the violence determined that domestic violent extremists are among the most persistent threats to the United States. And our research indicates that among these domestic violent extremists are a brand of so-called accelerationists, including some who advocate the use of nuclear weapons and dirty bombs to bring about their desired end state, and a subset of those who advocate attacks against nuclear installations. Other domestic violent extremists may not go as far, but they represent a threat to nuclear security nonetheless. Our paper and a companion paper focused just on the DVE threat, domestic violent extremist threat, highlight some notable recent insider threat cases that illustrate how such threats may go unnoticed or may not be acted upon when the threat looks and sounds like everyone around them. For example, Matthew Gebert, a white supremacist, granted continuous access to classified government information at the State Department, despite extremist behavior. And Ashley Babbitt, a US Air Force veteran and former nuclear power plant security guard who was shot and killed while participating in the January 6th Capitol breach, and whose previous run-ins with law enforcement did not affect her employment as a nuclear power plant security guard. So why does DEI matter for security? Diversity, equity, and inclusion values and initiatives have become central to efforts to address inequities and injustices in various workforces in various sectors of our economy. However, we argue that DEI values are also crucial to a strong and stable nuclear security culture. If you just look at personnel surety, misogynistic, racist, and other bigoted behavior should be considered indicators for insider threats. Jack Teixeira provides a recent and very high-profile example. I'm sure most audience members recall the Air National Guardsman who leaked highly classified material on the war in Ukraine on the Discord social media platform. And details continue to emerge. A recent Washington Post article revealed that Teixeira received his security clearance in 2019, despite having been suspended from school for making racist comments and talking about guns and war. It also said that DoD released a report by the Air Force Inspector General determining some negative information was discovered in the course of Teixeira's background check, but it wasn't shared with his unit. And other insider threat warning signals were also overlooked. Homogeneity in the workforce can create challenges identifying insider threats. And we spent quite a bit of time in one of our workshops discussing inhibitions to speaking up, even in workplaces that do have policies against misogynistic, racist, and bigoted behavior. In addition, an open environment for all staff to share concerns, whether about the behavior of others in general, or about specific nuclear security issues, is fundamental to nuclear security culture as defined by both the International Atomic Energy Agency and the World Institute for Nuclear Security. But without holistically integrated DEI security culture, nuclear facilities may fail to protect personnel from abuse, hostility, or incivility on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation, or other characteristic. As a result, individuals may be less likely to share concerns, which is directly opposite to widely accepted best practices for nuclear security. In addition, inequitable and unfair work environments can breed insider threats from unhappy, disaffected employees who are unhappy with how they're being, with their work environment and how they're being treated, who don't feel part of the workforce. They can impact how a guard force operates and the process by which organizations identify and mitigate potential security vulnerabilities. In other words, diversity, equity, and inclusion are in fact essential pieces in harnessing the potential of a nuclear workforce. An IAEA security culture guidance notes that the quality, and I'm quoting here, the quality of a decision is improved when the individuals involved are able to contribute their insights and ideas. And furthermore, an equitable work environment in which personnel feel included is also likely to breed higher employee satisfaction, which in turn improves performance. Thus, mainstreaming DEI into nuclear security culture can support insider threat mitigation efforts and reduce toxicity in a nuclear workplace, both of which would strengthen nuclear security implementation in the long run. And we argue that organizations have a responsibility to ensure that all employees understand not only their role in creating and sustaining a nuclear security culture, but how that role is facilitated by embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion values. So let me go back just quickly to the homogeneous nuclear security establishment I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Our paper presents our research on workforce demographics across government agencies with a role in nuclear security, as well as the private sector. The numbers that are available show a much lower percentage of women and minorities employed than white males. In other words, while the bias that may allow DVE threats to go unnoticed or unchallenged has deep historical roots, its effects continue to shape the nuclear security workforce today, manifesting in persistent DEI challenges in the nuclear sector. The bias is exercised in ways familiar for many other economic sectors, gendered, racial, and other stereotyping about appropriate fields of work and study, biased hiring decisions, harassment on the job, as well as lingering structural barriers such as family unfriendly work schedules or career advancement requirements or burdensome equipment. And in addition, the nuclear security field has particularly stringent clearance and ongoing personnel surety requirements, which may pose a barrier to already marginalized communities. So before I delve further into our concept for a DEI nuclear security culture and recommendations for implementing such a culture in the United States, it's important to note several challenges within the US context. The first of these is the debate over whether and how fast the nuclear industry will grow in the coming years and what demands that will place on the future workforce. Given the highly specialized nature of the industry, diversification of the workforce under any kind of growth scenario would require deliberate, intentional planning starting now. The sector is already facing a shortage of skilled labor, and priming the pipeline is critical to having both a skilled and diverse workforce. In addition, the geography of US demographic patterns is also important to take into account. Nuclear labs and power plants are in specific locations, sometimes with very homogeneous surrounding populations. And one of our interviewees noted that it may not be realistic to expect candidates from underrepresented groups to commit to long-term relocation to such a homogeneous community, given potential risks to their physical and emotional well-being. So that consideration needs to be thought through as well. Data collection and transparency is also an issue that needs to be addressed, but is complicated by the number and diversity of stakeholders in the US. In this field, federal government has taken, a number of steps, but there's more that could be done. And industry could also do more and provide a standard data across the sector. And finally, the rise of domestic violent extremism itself, enabled by social media platforms, raises some complex constitutional questions of free speech and surveillance of US citizens versus the interests of collective security. So I'll move on now to the conceptualization of a DEI nuclear security culture. And in conceptualizing this, we drew on some of the same organizational culture models developed by Edgar Schein that informed some leading sources of guidance already in the field from the IAEA and the World Institute of Nuclear Security. Schein's model emphasizes the importance of shared values and assumptions by all in the organization. And we believe these assumptions are key for all US nuclear security stakeholders to share. First, that developing an organizational culture that champions DEI principles is essential to successfully developing a DEI nuclear security culture. Second, that structural biases that unfairly exclude or isolate certain demographics must be recognized as an inherent weakness for nuclear security implementation. And third, that integrating DEI principles into nuclear security culture requires buy-in from a diverse range of stakeholders, including the state, organizations, managers, personnel, the public, and the international community. Those nuclear security stakeholders, culture stakeholders, are laid out in the IAEA's NSS 7, Nuclear Security Series number 7. They are represented here in the United States by the organizations, largely by the organizations listed here on this slide. This is not, there's many others, but we selected these as the sort of the most key, I think, to this concept. Each one has a critical role to play in the development and sustainment of a nuclear security culture, and therefore a DEI nuclear security culture. And we provide detailed recommendations for each of them in our report on how to better integrate DEI considerations into their part of the nuclear security enterprise. This slide presents just a snapshot of the top recommendations we have. So I would direct you to the report itself, the paper itself, for more detail on the recommendations by stakeholder. And although the slide does not break these recommendations out by stakeholder, I'm going to go through and try and give a sense of which are relevant to which stakeholders here. So starting with the left column as you look at the slide, of course, guidance and definitions are needed from the very top, from the White House and interagency policy committees, along with mandates for DEI training and consistent demographic data collection and reporting. The executive branch should also review the security clearance process. Rand Corporation has did a very nice report looking at the potential for bias in the security clearance process, but there's more, clearly there's more to be done there in looking at what actually is involved. And so they should also audit the continuous vetting programs for bias and champion national and international programs that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the sector, such as the NNSA Graduate Fellowship and the IAEA's Lees-Meitner program. Congress has a very important role to play in requiring the executive branch to undertake some of these actions, particularly the security clearance process review. At the level of individual US government agencies and organizations, as well as industry, our recommendations include actually gathering and publishing consistent workforce demographic data to provide comprehensive baseline and trend data going forward. Intelligence criteria for insider threat risk should be revisited to ensure that human reliability program indicators for identifying insider threats are consistent, and that insider threat program guidance contains metrics to consider risk from a variety of perspectives, including misbehaviors such as sexual harassment, racialized abuse, homophobic harassment, and religious othering. We also recommend that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission should develop guidance for industry on implementing DEI and mainstreaming DEI values into nuclear security culture, and should require workforce demographic data collection and publication. A specific recommendation for industry, in addition to those in common with other stakeholders, is to begin intentional and intensive advance planning now to meet commitments for creating a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizational and security culture going forward. And this planning must address retention and advancement strategies as well as hiring. Managers have a particular role to play in fostering a DEI nuclear security culture and must leave no doubt that they are all in to participate in organizational DEI initiatives. And by corollary, staff have responsibilities in demanding transparency and holding managers accountable for action and engaging themselves in DEI initiatives. And finally, the public has a variety of roles to play. NGOs should hold stakeholders accountable and analyze data and trends. Academia can ensure equitable access to educational resources to create a diverse pipeline of nuclear security professionals. And the media can ensure diversity of expert perspective and voices, and include voices from underrepresented communities. So with that, with a project like this, there's always more research to be done. This project is no exception. And I think most important at this point is to hear feedback on the paper and its recommendations, and that's something we're very eager to do. In the meantime, I wanted to thank everyone very much for their attention. I'm going to turn it over now to Viviana and Jack. I'm not sure if I see Viviana is back. So just given the technical issues she's experiencing, I'm going to turn it over to you first, Viviana, for your comments.
Yes. Thank you so much, Christina. I was having some problems with electricity in my town in Colombia, so it's quite challenging here, but I hope I can make it to the end without any other interruptions. Well, thank you so much for the invitation and for this great report. Regarding my comments, first, I would like to highlight the significance of conducting this type of research and generating reports of this nature. Actually, when I entered into the sector nearly 3 years ago, obtaining empirical data of the status of women in the field and even more on underrepresented minority groups was very challenging. And so the work undertaken by Stimson is vital for organizations like WINS, for example, for industry, for governments. It provides really a foundational understanding of the diversity landscape and also offers evidence and supporting why diversity is a fundamental element for improving nuclear security. I would like to touch base on 3 points that I found very insightful of the report. The first one is the notion of a threat. And insecurity and in nuclear aspects, we are constructed around the concept of what constitutes a threat. And a threat is often a person. So therefore, it's fundamental that the sector, we are aware of the impact that bias and preconceptions may have on threat assessment, for example. This can lead not just to unfair treatment, but also to mistakes in making crucial security decisions. And of course, this increases the occurrence of vulnerabilities. I believe this is a robust and key argument for the necessity of a diverse workforce in the sector, and also incorporating gender and intersectional lens into every aspect of nuclear security. The second aspect I would like to highlight of the report is the impact of bias. As the report highlights, the discontinued impact of bias and structural bias on improving the diversity of the sector. I believe that we need to focus on finding ways to overcome behaviors that hinder the entry and especially the retention and growth of women and minority groups in the field. Whether it's unfair hiring practices or the absence of uninclusive policies, I believe it's crucial to create conditions that allow women to stay and progress in the field and to get to manager and leadership positions. And unfortunately, this is not the case at the moment, and women still face everyday microaggressions, lack of support for promotion. And as the report highlighted very well, that it's something that we also have we find in our research in WINS is women sometimes don't have the adequate, for example, equipment to perform their duties. The other aspect I found very important is the political polarization, and especially regarding hate speech. I won't like to talk just about the US, but in many countries and regions globally, we are seeing like how this hate speech negatively impact minority groups, how public discourse influence people's behavior and especially group dynamics. And this kind of trend is jeopardizing our progress toward a more inclusive society, I believe. And unfortunately, last year we have been witnesses a rise of this radical and negative speech towards migration, for example, minority groups, and a backlash on DI, for example. I can speak from Latin America, where we have observed that phenomenon, for example, in Brazil during the past elections. And in Colombia, during the peace processes and the aftermath after the peace processes, we see how the violence in political speech reinforce violence also against human rights and environmental defenders. So it's something that always impact this kind of groups. I think I have covered what I wanted to cover and highlight the main points. And I over to you back, Christina. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Viviana. It's really great to get your perspective from WINS, World Institute for Nuclear Security, and the great research that you and your organization carry out in this field as well. And yeah, I couldn't agree more with your point about, the threat is often a person, and then that just brings in what the IAEA calls the human factor in judging and assessing, and there's just the room for bias that creeps in there, as well for personal bias, as well as the structural bias that you referenced, that's still active in this field as well as others. Thanks very much for those comments, very much appreciated. I'm going to turn it over to Jack for your reflections. Take it away. Thanks, Jack.
Great, thanks, Christina, and thanks to you and the team at Stimson for the invite to speak today. Always a pleasure to appear alongside Viviana anywhere. And just a foot stomp for anyone who has not seen the excellent work that Viviana and her colleagues at WINS have done on their gender framework. It's an incredible piece of research and a really applicable toolkit that touches the ground in really important ways, which a lot of research does not do. So huge credit there, and I encourage everyone to look into that further and find ways that it applies to your work. What I'll talk about today is maybe a little bit different than Viviana's remarks, because my sort of primary point of focus in looking at this policy paper is the way it helps us to build a bridge between the way we talk about these two sets of issues, DEI values and nuclear security implementation. From my perspective, the basis of this paper is an exploration of structural bias, implicit assumption, and how who we are colors the way that we perceive the world. This kind of work's incredibly challenging, but it's critically important. People have the tendency to view both DEI and nuclear security as really siloed topics, when in reality, they're quite the opposite. Nuclear security is a shared responsibility that's held by all governments and implemented by a broad range of organizations, and therefore it requires a really complex interplay between different entities. And you'll see some sample of that in the slide that Christina showed, breaking out the different stakeholder groups involved in nuclear security implementation. It is a very wide-ranging cast of characters there. DEI, on the other hand, directly addresses how people behave as individuals and in groups. It's a fundamental concern for organizations of all shapes and sizes. Every entity on that slide has concerns about how individuals behave as themselves within organizations, as well as groups of employees or organizations as a whole. That is a fundamental DEI consideration rooted in human and group psychology. Interactions between people within an organization take place against the backdrop of an organizational culture, which Christina made a few references to in her remarks as well. In a business context, which is where this is most often discussed in my experience, a positive organizational culture is considered a driver of effectiveness for the organization, of employee satisfaction, of retention, and cohesion. So connecting this to Christina's remarks earlier, in a nuclear security context, culture encompasses all of these things, the effectiveness of the organization, the satisfaction of the employees, but it's also an important means of insider threat mitigation and therefore of risk management, because risk is introduced anytime people are working in this context. By connecting established insider threat case studies to existing threat assessment measures, the policy paper that Christina and her colleagues have produced takes a really great step forward in exploring the impact of structural bias on cultural assumptions, which are a piece of an organizational culture. Security is fundamentally human at all levels. Technology, of course, has played an ever-increasing role in the implementation of security measures, but fundamentally, it is the people within an organization who are the prime implementers and prime actors of any and all security measures. And to the point that Viviana made, they are also, in the way we talk about nuclear security, the threat in many ways, the human factor, to use the IAEA terminology that Christina correctly pointed out. The field of behavioral science has produced some really incredible work showing that where human brains use heuristics, which are basically processing shortcuts that enable our human brains to make faster decisions, cognitive biases are consistently introduced in the decision-making process. It is just a fact of how the brain works. Many of these cognitive biases are addressed, if not explicitly, then structurally in the development of nuclear security best practice and in the implementation of nuclear security measures. So, for example, things like bounded rationality or the illusion of validity are addressed through the structured development of security measures, the rollout, the planning process. There are elements there that are designed to control for cognitive bias in threat and risk assessment. However, we do have a significant and growing body of research that shows the presence of affinity bias in human decision-making, which is a symptom or a manifestation of exactly the kind of structural bias that this paper addresses. And the improved outcomes seen by more diverse teams are also well proven by an existing and growing body of research. But despite that, there's been very little progress on incorporation explicitly and specifically of a DEI lens into nuclear security implementation and the development of security culture. So very importantly, Christina cited a few pieces of IAEA guidance that sort of allude to this, which is a very important foundational piece of how nuclear security measures are designed and implemented. Nuclear security guidance from the IAEA and places like WINS are really the best that we have in shaping how nuclear security is implemented. But coming back to the point that I made at the front of my remarks here, I am most concerned with how we talk about these two issues, because I am firmly possessed of the belief that this needs to be an explicit approach to identifying what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what the outcomes are. So ultimately, we're left with the question of how to incorporate a DEI lens into the work of nuclear security implementation. And from my perspective, first, I think that we need to recognize that the issues that a DEI research lens surfaces are symptoms of broader structural issues that exist within society. We cannot solve them at an organizational level, and we're not trying to do that. You know, so much of the conversation about incorporating DEI and the use of the word equity and other places where we see, resistance or friction to these concepts is sort of focused on this idea that, everyone who cares about this work is trying to save the world and reverse these broad structural trends. I think at the implementation level, it's very clear that that's not what's happening. But these structural biases can be identified, controlled for, and addressed as symptoms of broader societal trends. And when we talk about organizational culture, it's very important that we do that effectively. Second, there's enormous value in making the connections between DEI and other topics explicit. This paper contains a brief but very well-considered overview of the headwinds facing DEI efforts in the US context. So some of the forces that are pushing back on progress on these issues, or places where we can expect to see further friction. And the accompanying policy paper is probably even a deeper dive into certain aspects of where we see these headwinds. Generally speaking, as I just said, these forces are driven by discourse that, to my mind, perhaps intentionally, largely addresses DEI as an isolated concept, keeping it in a silo and making it much easier to malign as a fringe movement or address in an abstract as something that's not applicable. The more we, in conversation or in discourse, make the context we're working in specific or a special snowflake example, the much easier it is to sort of isolate these arguments and say that, well, it doesn't apply in this context. Nuclear security is national security relevant. It involves sensitive information and sensitive facilities, and therefore these concepts don't apply. And I think one of the great value adds of this policy paper is drawing that connection, building that bridge between these two topics and showing that these concepts are explicitly applicable in nuclear security. There's a reason that Harvard Business Review's research showing the effectiveness of more diverse teams has gained so much traction. It draws a complex topic that challenges bias down to a tangible, applicable context, and it's backed by research. That enables the opening of a much broader and frankly deeper conversation about what this means, what the impacts are, and how we get to this stage of implementation. With these connections made explicit, the rationale for controlling for structural bias in nuclear security becomes clear and much more difficult to dismantle as some kind of abstract concept. I think everyone who works in nuclear security would agree that development and implementation of strong security measures should always include an assessment of assumptions and biases. This should be as true for application of a DEI lens and threat assessment as it should be for the use of force-on-force exercises to test physical security measures, for example. These are very important practices that strengthen security measures in fundamental ways. Nuclear security is a continuous responsibility. There is no end point at which we say, okay, it's good enough, we can walk away now. So, ultimately what I think is that with this paper, Christina, Annie, Anina, Sneha, and anyone else who contributed to it in any capacity, whether it be through interviews, through survey, through roundtable conversations, they've added a really important stone to the foundation of an explicit body of research that needs to grow. And I think Christina alluded to this in her remarks. But it's incredibly important that this conversation continue, that the research continue, that the discussion of how these things are connected continue. Shifting the discourse away from DEI as an isolated concept and toward an understanding of the deeper implications of failing to check affinity bias and other impacts of structural bias on threat assessment, security culture, nuclear security implementation would be a really strong step forward for nuclear security worldwide. And I know this paper focuses on the US context for a number of reasons, but it's true everywhere from my perspective. The recommendations provided in this policy paper chart several courses forward in doing this, but ultimately what I look forward to is seeing the body of relevant work grow and watching the resulting conversation develop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jack. That's for that really thorough dive into the paper and your reflections on it. I think one thing that I wanted to just pick up on briefly was your comment about how we can't really solve the deeper societal issues. Like this is a sort of society-wide. These are society-wide issues that we're talking about, and they can't be completely solved at an organizational level. And in fact, I think it was very interesting. One of our interviews sort of raised that exact question, that exact issue, pointing out that, it's a lot of DEI initiatives do sort of take place in the workplace. They take place in this sort of social arena, where people are being asked to do things that they're maybe not being asked to do in their home environment. And so there's just a lot more we can make these recommendations. They may help somewhat, but there is a lot more work to be done. And I think I'm really glad that you amplified the point about this needs to be a sort of ongoing dialogue and more research and a stone and sort of foundation of this body of work. So thanks for that. I also wanted to we've got a couple of questions from the audience. I want to give everybody a little bit of time to sort of collect their thoughts and formulate some questions, which we want to leave time to get to those from our audience members. But just wanted to pick up quickly the point about we were focused on the U.S. context for this research, which was very helpful in bounding the issue. It was a big topic, even just limiting ourselves to the United States. But I know we have audience members from other parts of the world, and both NTI and WINS work internationally and look at the big global picture. I want to turn to both of you for reflections on how these issues play out. Is this exclusively a U.S. challenge, or does it have relevance in other parts of the world, and how does that play out? Viviana, I'll turn to you first on that question.
Thank you, Christina. So I don't believe that bias and barriers are unique to the US. Are prevalent, I think, globally, and as Jack mentioned, is a society structural phenomenon. Women face structural and personal biases through their careers, particularly in deeply patriarchal societies, like mine, for example. And in WINS, we work in different regions, as you said, and we tend to see similar patterns regarding structural bias, discrimination against women into the STEM fields, for example, also into the military. And probably what I see the difference of what changed in regions like Latin America, for example, is that there are some of these biases and barriers that exacerbate regarding, for example, other identity categories like socioeconomic background, geographical location, and ethnicity, race. And that's why we have undertaken in all our programs and projects an intersectional approach to understand how, for example, privilege works in the workplace and to the access to the field. What I believe is what I was thinking about this question is that US serves as a great laboratory due to its cultural diversity, and the experience related to bias and DEI in nuclear security are diverse and can be observed and studied within the US context, and it could provide a great valuable insights for addressing these issues. And also, what I think that the US could be a really good role modeling in best practices. We tend to follow in our countries to the US policies, and I think that it's very important what is been cooking there, and we can always follow that great practices at the regional or global scale as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Viviana. Jack, any thoughts on your end on applicability beyond the United States context?
Yeah, I have to, firmly agree with everything that Viviana just said, and I was quite happy to hear her use the word intersectional in description of the WINS approach. I think this is quite a challenging conversation to have internationally, and folks who work on it internationally will recognize that. One advantage that I think both Viviana and I have in the work that we do is that it operates under the masthead of gender, right, which is a group division that's present all around the world. But I think, you'll see different perceptions of the presence of structural bias in every part of the world. And of course, perhaps most notably, Director General Rafael Grossi at the IAEA has made a very public, very strong commitment to bringing gender parity to the agency itself. But even between the US and Europe, we often talk past each other on the well-established issue of gender. We see a different vocabulary used to focus on different issues. And this, to me, is a manifestation of the fact that every country has a very different relationship with structural bias. Of course, the US has its own unique history with racial justice. Other countries, as Viviana pointed out, may have a stronger focus on socioeconomic divisions, rural versus urban divisions, military versus non-military divisions. And I think there are forms of this consideration present in every corner of the world. Another piece of this that is not lost on me is the national level angle. There are a lot of ways of discussing what DEI means in nuclear security, and the diversity of participation piece is applicable at the human level, but is also applicable at the level of states. It has long been the narrative that nuclear security leadership is the sort of province of more developed countries in the global north, or North America and Western Europe. And, from our perspective, nuclear security is a truly shared responsibility where every government has a significant role to play. There is risk mitigation to be done at all levels. And, to plug some of our own work at NTI, and the latest edition of the NTI Index released in July, we actually found that the greatest progress made on nuclear security since 2020 has been in the global south and not in the global north, as it has been in the past. So I think I have some hope that this paradigm might be shifting, but long story short, yes, absolutely. Every country has to tango with structural bias on some level.
Great. No, I appreciate that, and points well taken. Every country has its own. I think that's very, very apt, Jack. That every country has its own, structural barriers, its own framework of which it's operating. Needs to think about this in a national context. I think we're going to turn now to some questions from our audience. We have, just since we're getting a little close to time, we have one here. Do you see room for similar DEI sentiments at a state level? And I believe this the state here is meaning country, national entity. Involves small and what are perceived as weaker states in the nuclear security dialogue. So I think that goes a lot to what we've just been talking about here, in terms of absolutely that, to Jack's point, that this is very much a dialogue that every country in the world has a role to play in nuclear security, and that certainly the weaker states have just as great a role as as bigger states in addressing these challenges and in creating a nuclear security culture. But let me turn it over to Viviana for thoughts there as well.
Yes, I do believe that there is a conversation going on right now at state level. Also, I think it's Annie that mentioned smaller states that have probably or embarking states working in nuclear security. Yeah, I mean there is a big sentiment right now, probably in the global north, regarding DEI and nuclear security. I have seen a little bit less on the side of states embarking on nuclear and in nuclear security, because there are all other kind of actions to prioritize for those states. So I believe we have a long way to go, in which we are trying also to look at the future with the global south and starting building on best practices and starting to do some research in the region, for example, in Latin America right now, with a project that we have to start seeing how DEI can be integrated into policies, into the work we are doing and states are doing. But I believe it's a long way to go, and I believe the global north probably has this a priority right now, but probably in the global south there are other conversations going on as we face other challenges, kind of more structural challenges and poverty and healthcare and other kind of social problems. So I believe that there is room for it, but it will take some time until we kind of arrive to the point of the global north is, or like nuclear countries are at the moment on DI issues.
Thanks, Viviana, and I'll turn it over to Jack for your thoughts as well on this.
Yeah, I think absolutely yes up front. I think Viviana makes a really good point about kind of disparate approaches and priorities, but I also think that it's really important that the discourse around these issues in particular be international and diverse in representation by their very nature, exactly because every country has different perspectives, different priorities, and different points to be made here. Thinking about the comment that Viviana made about embarking countries as well, countries considering development of nuclear power programs or countries looking at deploying new nuclear generation capacity, from the perspective of nuclear security practitioners, it is good nuclear security that unlocks the peaceful benefits of the uses of nuclear energy. And an inclusive nuclear security culture is key as kind of a fundamental phase of the development of a strong nuclear security enterprise. So I think, as these conversations evolve within the IAEA, within the sort of development of nuclear security best practice, it's incredibly important that there be broad participation in places like the IAEA's Nuclear Security Guidance Committee, where nuclear security best practice is developed, formed, and shaped using the input from a broad range of countries. So I think this is another place where I'll come back to how we talk about these issues. It's very easy to get caught up in this idea of, different countries having a particular DEI focused conversation, but there are a lot of ways of sort of, slicing the pie here and getting a broader range of countries engaged in discussion about nuclear security culture, threat assessments, development of nuclear security culture is in fact one approach or a piece of an approach to this issue. I'm the firmest believer that we cannot devote ourselves entirely to a single line of approach on an issue like this. I had a very smart boss at one point who told me that an issue like this requires top-down, bottom-up, inside-out work to address. And I think that's very true in every context, whether it be in an individual workplace or the international development of nuclear security culture. So yes, absolutely a role for everyone to play. And there are a lot of fora in which to work on these issues, and we should not lose sight of that.
Great points from both of you. Really appreciate those ideas and comments. Somewhat related, we have a question here, and I want to leave. We have two more questions. I want to get to both of them. So just briefly, this question here: nuclear security cannot be isolated as an entity free of influence or pressure. Stakeholders can try to make adjustments, but they can't remain unaffected. To strengthen security culture, formation of a permanent watchdog or oversight body might create an equilibrium, and we're asked to comment on that. I would turn to Viviana first for thoughts on that suggestion.
Sorry, I was having some interruptions. Can you please repeat the question? So I found it in the Q&A.
Yes, I think the question is getting at whether, I think it's in the context of DEI, would some sort of oversight body, maybe a national body, or it's hard to tell if we're talking about a national body or an international body devoted to oversight of DEI issues in nuclear security, would that be helpful or not? That's my interpretation of the question.
Well, I do believe, from the research that we have done, for example, for our reporting framework, we conclude that absolutely government mandates have an impact on advancing gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. And this is particularly important on, for example, gender pay gap. Governments that have this mandate on place have and industries that follow this mandate have better outcomes on gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. So an entity that oversees gender equality, diversity, and inclusion is not a bad idea for nuclear security. I don't know how realistic it is that this body exists, because of course every country has their own legislation, their own policy, and also industry are led by this policy. So the work that the IAEA is doing with the statement of Mr. Grossi regarding gender equality has been quite effective in my opinion on making some changes in the sector. But I do believe that more than a body that oversights will be like a strong leadership within governments and strong leadership within organizations and institutions. And this is what I believe is more effective than somebody that controls DI issues in nuclear security.
Yeah, so leadership over and guidance over some sort of oversight or direct control. I think we have time for one more question, which I'm going to pitch to Jack here, and it's a combination of two questions. I think they're related. So one is, what is the role of gender champions in nuclear policy for mitigating the bias that we've been talking about and creating a more diverse nuclear field? And a related question is, how will implementing the Women, Peace, and Security agenda of the Security Council and the strategy of the United States help mitigate bias in nuclear security? So how will these sort of initiatives that are underway help with these issues? And we got about 1 minute to tackle that one. So
you had me ready for a softball with a question about gender campaigns, and then I get WPS at the end. Okay, so I think this comes back to my point about multiple lines of approach, right? One, what is the value of gender champions in nuclear policy? I'm the most biased person you could ask this question for, because this is 5 years of my own personal work. I see great value in exactly what Viviana just said: public, clear commitment from people in positions of leadership often the highest positions of leadership, is a way of setting tone, establishing culture, and making values very clear. That can change the way organizations operate. If you work within an organization and you know that the person sitting in the seat of the CEO, the president, the highest executive cares about these things and has a stated position on them, that filters down, and it also creates a precedent for management of these issues and mainstreaming of them throughout the work of the organization. To me, that public commitment is maybe the most obvious piece of importance with Gender Champions. When it comes to other aspects of how Gender Champions helps mitigate this bias, not all of our membership works specifically on nuclear security. We have a wide range of members in our organization, but for example, those who do work on nuclear security implementation in some capacity set annual commitments to sort of change the culture and practice of their organization, and they use an approach backed by monitoring and evaluation practices to hold themselves accountable and to push forward on it. That's how you change the culture and practice of an organization, one brick at a time, and it's very important. It's one of those things that it's important not to minimize the small stuff. When it comes to WPS, I think the mainstreaming of this is the biggest piece to me. Thinking about the question that Viviana just answered about oversight bodies, the best thing that we can do is steep every piece of our institutions in these concepts if we want to make them effective and applicable. WPS does that in a lot of ways. It empowers different pieces of our federal system in the United States to address women, peace, and security and gender issues in very specific ways. It uses the machinery that's already available, and that to me is the most powerful piece of that approach. I think I'm out of time now, but hopefully that answers the question.
I think that's a great way to end the session. That's a great point. And a great addition for us to think about in future, moving our research forward that did not make it into our paper, and I think that's a great recommendation. But really appreciate, it's been an honor to present our work here today to all of our audience members. Thanks for taking the time to listen and learn. Please do check out the report and its companion piece on our website. And it's been a true honor to have this discussion with Viviana and Jack, two leading lights in the field on these issues. And we wish everyone a very great